In this module, I want to explain to you why I created this course. I talk about death and grief a lot, and some people find that to be a sad thing. They think it would make me sad. I speak with people all day long who have been, who are in grief, who's had someone passed away, who's experienced this awful tragedy. But for me, it's not depressing at all because I believe that death is a natural part of life, and I know we don't like to think about it, but it is. And the thing is that the reluctance to talk about death often leaves us unprepared for grief, the grief that we are inevitably going to face. And I'm really here to reduce fear with people as we face this thing that we would rather turn away with. Our society in general, we don't talk about death. We turn away from it. Death is kind of hidden from us. Back when people lived on farms, when children lived on farms, they saw the death of animals all around us. Just a couple of generations ago, people actually died at home. My father had a brother who passed away when he was young, and they would bring the bodies of the people who had died back to the home in the parlor for a few days, and people would come and visit. Children and everyone knew death is kind of a part of life. Today, many people die isolated in hospitals, in nursing homes, and other health facilities. People can go their whole lives until they're adults and never have even seen a dead body. And this leaves us unprepared to handle the grief that we're going to deal with. Now, grief can impact our lives in many ways, and there are no linear stages of grief. I do want to put that myth to rest right now. But there are some stages or some phases or whatever that we go through that are very common. Things like shock, things like acute grief, a chronic grief. So grief can be very intense for a while. Grief can be prolonged. In addition, there are emotions like anger, depression, fear, guilt. Those often accompany grief. And those emotions can take their toll on our health, on our happiness, and even on our families if we don't know how to manage them. Grief in the workplace can be very uncomfortable for both the griever and the people around them. And a lot of times people are encouraged to return to work as soon as possible, often in just days or weeks. And that might be okay if your grandmother passes away and you just need to, pop over to somewhere to go to the funeral. But it's when it's, say, a spouse or a child and you're expected to return to work and people are uncomfortable around you because you're so sad you're making them uncomfortable. I've actually worked with people who've been called into the boss's office and told that they were being too sad and they were making their coworkers uncomfortable, believe it or not. So learning how to deal with grief as both a griever and someone dealing with the bereaved is, I think, a really important skill. Now, there's an often repeated myth that most couples who lose a child end up in divorce, some vast percentage. That's based on a misunderstanding. It was something that was published in a book, I believe it was in the 1960s, taken as gospel and got spread around. It's not necessarily true that if you lose a child that you're destined for a divorce. In fact, it can be the opposite, but grief can take a big toll on relationships. When two people grieve in different ways, that can often lead to misunderstanding. One person might want to talk about the one who died like incessantly. Another person might not ever want to mention their name again. So that can lead to conflict, and understanding that there are different styles of grief, different ways that people grieve, and appreciating that your spouse may not grieve the way you do, and learning to give them space and to give them grace can be something that can be very beneficial for your relationship and can even save a marriage. Now, there are many models for grief. And unfortunately, those models are beyond the scope of this course, but I want to go over briefly a couple of basic things about the models of grief. Sigmund Freud thought of grief as a disorder. He thought of it as something to be overcome. He believed that the ego, the self that we are, needed to withdraw its energy from the object of attachment, that object of attachment being your loved one. So when I say this to people who are parents who have lost children or someone whose spouse recently died, they almost laugh at it. The idea that we're going to withdraw our energy from the object of our attachment, because we know, as in the name of this course, that love never dies. That love that we have for that person is never going to die. And we are never going to withdraw that attachment. The latest diagnostic and statistical manual, the DSM-5, defines prolonged grief as a disorder. The medical community often sees grief as an unhealthy attachment or an addiction. Now, the fact is that there is a form of grief that can be seen as a disorder if it's very prolonged and it's very profound. But grief has often been seen as something as a need to overcome the attachment to our loved ones. And the thing about this prolonged grief disorder that was recently put in the DSM-5, a lot of people were excited about it because they were looking at this as kind of an addiction. That if you're addicted to the person, we could treat grief like an addiction and break that desire to be with the other person. I don't think that grief is a disorder. It's a natural part of loving someone. And when that person dies, the love does not die. It's just love that doesn't seem to have a place to go because we still have that love for that person and we can't find them. I've heard a lot of people talk about, how do I find my loved one? Where are they? And people have written books with the titles of finding, fill in the blank, finding my son, finding Aaron is one that comes to mind. Um, so some people are still looking for a pill to break that addiction. But people that have been in the kind of grief that I've known and people that I know that have been in grief, for example, losing a child, we don't want to break that addiction. We don't want to break that bond. We know that bond will never be broken. I recently studied with David Kessler, and David Kessler has come up with 6 things that people need in grief. Things that David said people in grief need are to have your pain witnessed. People want to know that you know their pain. When people are in grief, now, you're not going to know exactly what they feel like, and people in grief don't expect you to know exactly what they feel like. But people in grief want to know that you understand that they are in pain, and they don't want to be told to get over it or hasn't it been long enough or things of that nature. The pain is very real and can last for a very long time. People in grief need to express their feelings. They need to be able to express their feelings without judgment. One of the reasons I think people find it valuable working with me as a child, as a parent who's lost a child, is that I don't judge people for whatever it is they might tell me, whether it's they feel guilty about the way their loved one passed, whether their child passed, whether it's they're having thoughts of not wanting to be here anymore, whether it's they feel anger still at whoever caused it, whatever their emotions are, because all these emotions are normal when we're going through grief. And people in grief want to be able to express that without judgment. And when they're talking to someone that understands, it gives them permission to express that. People in grief want to be able to release the burden of guilt. Now, almost inevitably, when someone close to us dies, we find a way to blame ourselves. I have heard some very, very far-fetched things that parents have said about what they should or shouldn't have done with their children to save their lives. Grown children who have died from drug overdoses or drunk driving accidents or even cancer or other natural causes, parents especially seem to find a way to blame themselves. And a lot of times people will blame themselves for not being there when their loved one died. Oh, I'm sorry I wasn't there. I should have been there when they passed away. Whatever the reason might be, we find ways to have guilt. And people in grief need to be able to release that burden of guilt. Because the thing is, guilt holds us back from being able to heal. It even puts in our mind that maybe we don't deserve to heal. And if I don't deserve to heal, how can I move forward with healing? People in grief need to be free of old wounds. Grief often stirs up old wounds that we didn't realize were still there, even wounds from childhood. So when we go through an intense emotional experience and it stirs everything up, sometimes we get hit with these emotions, these wounds from our past, and we need to be able to be free of those wounds. It could be relationships you had with your parents, things that you never even would associate with the grief you're going through. People in grief need to be able to integrate the pain and the love. And this is very, very important. Grief is a mixture of pain and love. So when we think of our loved ones, we'll often cry. And for some reason, sometimes people don't want to look, for example, at a picture of their loved one. They might be triggered by having the feeling of their loved one. But it's also love. That love is still there. And that's why the pain is there. And I love this thing that Joe Biden, he said, one day, when you think of your loved one, it will bring a smile to your lips before it brings a tear to your eye. And I think that's very, very important. It doesn't mean that the tear doesn't come to your eye. It means that you'll think of that, of the memories of them, the pleasant things, maybe even the ongoing relationship before the tear comes to your eye. But we'll always carry that pain and that love together. And we need to be able to integrate them into our lives as we move forward. The grief doesn't get smaller. There's some people that say, ask, does grief get easier as we go forward? The answer to that, I believe, is yes and no. The grief stays the same, I think, but we get stronger, we get bigger, we can carry the grief easier. In that sense, it might feel like the grief has gotten smaller. And lastly, we need to be able to find meaning after loss. Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. Finding meaning is possibly the most essential part of being human. We seek meaning in life. We seek to understand why things happened, or that something that happened serves a purpose. We seek to know that we have a purpose, that we have meaning. We can put meaning in our life. So the goal is to put the loss into context. The goal is to put the loss that we've experienced into context, understand maybe the reasons why it might have happened, figure out what we can do now. How do we move forward? And find a way to make meaning and purpose out of the tragedy. And I know that may sound impossible at this point, but I'm going to ask you for right now just to take that on faith until we get to the end of the course. And I'll talk about making meaning and purpose out of the tragedy.